We're joined for this segment with Derwyn Bunton, who is the Chief Public Defender for Orleans Parish. That's New Orleans, Louisiana. Derwyn, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I wanted you to talk just a little bit about your office in New Orleans and the challenges of representing poor people accused of crimes in New Orleans.
Well, I think our challenges aren't unique to a lot of offices. We have in our state and in our city a large volume of cases, a large volume of serious cases, and very few resources to handle all of those cases. And we've been fighting over the last few years trying to even the playing field and trying to provide excellent public defender services for poor folks in the parish. And it's been up and down, but we've been largely successful in a lot of ways. We've had our setbacks, but the challenges remain like everybody else's, sort of resources, trying to get resources to folks who need them.
And talk a little bit about how the lack of resources, I mean, you've actually lost some funding in the last few years. Mm-hmm. How does that affect your lawyers, and how does that affect the way your office handles cases?
Well, from a very technical standpoint, it increases caseload. So right. Caseload begins to rise as you begin to lose lawyers. And as you begin to lose staff, collateral staff, investigators, court support, those kinds of folks, it makes the workload much harder because you're asking everybody in the office to do more. And so what you have is a lot of very overburdened, overworked staff, and that can take its toll on your staff. So your turnover rate may begin to be affected. Also, your preparation for cases. If you begin to triage more and more as a frontline defender so that you try to figure out, unfortunately, in many cases, how to cut corners to handle what are the most serious first and then move on down.
So what it really means is each client doesn't get the individualized representation that we would hope.
No, and that's exactly right. And in the case of our office, at the beginning of 2012, we had to cut a lot of staff. We had huge layoffs, about a third of our staff. But rather than just embrace all these extra cases, what we had to do is simply stop taking them because we had the money to represent the folks that we could represent and use the staff that we could responsibly represent. Everyone else, we began what was a wait list for representation.
And who handled those other cases? When your office can't handle a case, who represents the defendants in those cases?
Well, what we did is we reached out to the private bar, the local bar, and we created a pro bono consortium. And we reached out to some of the corporate law firms in New Orleans who were very active already with our office, and they were able to take some cases from the wait list. The judges started appointing lawyers as well, and they were doing cases pro bono as well on those cases. But there were still a few, because of the volume of cases, there were a few folks who just sat unrepresented for probably about 3 months.
Without any lawyer at all?
Without any lawyer at all.
Let me ask you to describe a little bit in Louisiana generally, capital representation. Somebody is facing the death penalty, and Louisiana has sentenced a number of people to death, and it's carried out a number of executions. What's the system, if there is one, in Louisiana for providing representation to people facing the death penalty?
Well, the system in Louisiana is a bit of a quilt. So you have 42 judicial districts, each with their own chief. And
Chief Public Defender.
Chief Public Defender.
Right.
So at the first level, it's the district. And so some districts contract with folks, some districts handle it in-house, and also within those different districts you have nonprofits who handle capital cases at the trial level as well. And so what happens is, if you're charged with a capital crime in Louisiana, you could have the district, you could have a district contractor, or you could have a nonprofit representing you, just depending on sort of where you line up in the order of cases as they come in.
And just speaking generally, does the quality of representation differ between those different ways of providing representation?
No, it's incredibly uneven. We have our state, our Louisiana Public Defender Board, which was sort of reformed and revamped in 2007, now controls the sort of certification of capital lawyers and is trying to have a more robust program in how they certify lawyers. And so some of the lawyers who used to handle capital cases, for example, very few, but some were decertified, for example, because they just weren't living up to standard.
Right.
And you still had others that in the districts who didn't have resources. So capital cases have to be staffed up with 2 attorneys, mitigation specialists, and investigator. Some of the districts can't afford that or are gambling that the case won't stay capital. So
Right.
what you'll get maybe is just one lawyer on the capital case, hoping that it gets indicted as something lesser or that they can work with the DA to make it something lesser. But of course, invariably, those cases come back capital, and all of a sudden you're behind in your representation. And so not only do you have a quality differential, because some lawyers simply aren't ready,
Right.
but you also have a resource differential,
Right.
because you just don't have the resources to staff them up.
In some parishes, actually, a case can just sit for even years waiting to be funded. Is that true?
That is absolutely true. One of our most unique cases in Louisiana was Citizen versus Louisiana, or Louisiana versus Citizen.
And Citizen was an individual. That was
Citizen
his name, not the citizen.
That's
it was
right.
A man named Citizen.
The man named Citizen.
Right.
And what happened in that case is that they just didn't have, they ran out of money for the representation and filed for assistance with resources, got denied everywhere they went, and the court stopped the case. And it went up to our Louisiana Supreme Court, and the Louisiana Supreme Court said you either find money or you have to halt prosecution. You can't prosecute without a defense. And by the way, your speedy trial clock is ticking. Like, this
Right.
doesn't stop any of that.
Right.
And what they found was the parish, this was in Calcasieu Parish, this is southwest Louisiana,
Lake Charles.
Lake Charles. All around the municipality, there were fund balances, there were reserves that
Right.
no one wanted to give to public defense.
Right.
You had a multi-million-dollar reserve with what's called the police jury, which is one
Right.
of the law enforcement funding mechanisms there. You had a fund balance, a reserve with the district attorney's office, a reserve with the sheriff, a reserve with the courts, and none of them, and these are multi-million-dollar reserves, none of them wanted to provide any additional funds so that the Sixth Amendment could be realized in this capital case. It was really remarkable.
So that fund was funding the law enforcement, is funding the courts, and is funding the district attorney's office, but absolutely no money for the public defender.
No, and still doesn't.
And still doesn't.
And still doesn't. And that's why what you have right now in Lake Charles, for example, their public defender's office is right in the middle of a service restriction.
Right.
They had to withdraw from about 400 cases.
Wow.
Because they simply couldn't afford to handle them.
Wow. Well, I know at one time Jason Manuel Reeves, a case that came out of Calcasieu Parish, they had one of those nonprofit organizations represented him at his first trial, but then at the second trial, the judge took them off and put the local public defender, and I think he was carrying like 500 cases.
Oh yeah, at that time, that public defender's office, they've gone through some changes, but at that time, and still now, their caseloads wildly exceed national standards by almost any measure. You've got lawyers who carry about 800 misdemeanors, for example, which is about twice the national standard, and about 400 felonies, again, about twice the national standard.
So you take those lawyers that are already handling twice the national standard, and then you give them a capital case on top of that.
That's exactly what happens. And one of the cases that was recently argued in the U.S. Supreme Court was a case called Boyer, Louisiana versus Boyer. And what happened in Boyer's case is there was simply no money to fund his representation. And so it took him, I think, 5 years to get to trial on his case.
Right.
Not because it was a particularly complex and long case, but they simply were slow going because they didn't have the money.
Right.
And there's a question now on the speedy trial issue, whose fault is it?
Right.
And should this conviction be reversed and kicked out? And so we're awaiting word from the Supreme Court on that case as well.
And the state took the position in that case that they were not responsible for the delay.
That's correct.
Even though obviously the state of Louisiana has the money to pay for a defense if they want it. When you seek the death penalty in Louisiana, it's sought in the name of the state of Louisiana, isn't it?
That's absolutely correct. And their position was, so what?
My goodness. What are you doing in New Orleans with regard to representing people in capital cases?
Well, we just started a capital division. What we've been able to do over the past 4 years is really grow a lot of strong talent in our office, and wanted to figure out how to provide representation basically all the way through in every sort of case that could enter the parish, while at the same time continuing a sort of tradition of excellence, because we were having the same problem as the rest of the state was with contractors who were sort of problematic in how they were staffing up and
these are people
cases.
who would contract to handle cases for like a flat fee.
Well, it's a fee for service for capital,
right?
But there's very few capitally certified lawyers around the state.
Right.
And we wanted to sort of create a pipeline to certify lawyers inside our staff. And it was a way for folks to sort of move through the leadership ranks in the office, along with building different capacities. So we started a capital defender division in our office this year.
How many lawyers do you have in it?
Right now, we just have 2 lawyers. And so we still contract with sort of trusted folks
right.
for any cases that go beyond standard right now. But my deputy chief leads the division and is an excellent lawyer and has won praise from many different corners of lawyering. So we're very proud of how the program is progressing. We also have a great young lawyer who had experience in Brian Stevenson's shop at EJI in Alabama, and has always sort of wanted to be a capital defender. So we're excited about what's to come.
That's going to be a big challenge with your resources, though, right? Because that one capital case is going to take a whole lot more resources than many, many, many misdemeanor cases or less serious felony cases.
No, and that's exactly what we're seeing. And so we're going to be really talking with local stakeholders in the state to talk about how, since we do have this division now, that we're going to need the resources to staff it. And we, in Orleans Parish, our district attorney doesn't have the sort of appetite for capital cases that others do. So we're hoping that
that's a change, isn't it?
It's a real change. He started sort of guns blazing, but found out that it is incredibly sort of wasteful and costly for these cases in Orleans Parish. The case he actually began his career with a capital case as DA with a capital case, actually won a capital conviction, but because of an enormous Brady violation, it was...
That is, failure to disclose exculpatory evidence.
Right.
Right.
Because of a huge Brady violation, that case was reversed, and then ultimately resolved with a manslaughter conviction. So it was one of those. So I think after that experience, he's like, all right, that was a whole lot of money for nothing, and we don't see a lot of capital indictments anymore.
And of course, when Harry Connick was the district attorney, you had lots of capital cases
Yes.
and lots of violations of failure to turn over exculpatory evidence.
Lots of violations, almost no capital convictions, and no death sentences for out of Orleans for more than a decade. But he still kept them coming, and what we're also finding out now through subsequent litigation is that it wasn't playing by the rules.
Right. So how much of a drain it is on your system is going to depend very much on those 2 decisions the prosecutor makes, whether to seek the death penalty and then whether to resolve the case with some sort of plea offer.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And that's what we see in our parish right now. The big bottleneck is, when are you going to make a real decision, Mr. DA? So from arrest, the police will arrest at first degree. And then he has 120 days to decide, if he wants to, whether he's going to go capital or not. But we have to staff it in that time period,
right,
like it's a capital
like
case.
It's a capital case.
And that's how we move forward in our office. So the faster that decision comes, the less strain on our resources we have.
Because it's enormous responsibility to investigate the life and background of the client, mitigation, all those things that you would not do if the case was not capital, is it?
No, and that's exactly right. And I think that's what a lot of folks miss, particularly a lot of DAs in Louisiana.
District attorneys.
District attorneys,
Right.
because we were recently had staff in Boston researching the life of a client who's charged capital, and they don't understand why you're running back to Boston.
Right.
And it's like, because his life led him through there, and
Right.
we have to figure out, we have to investigate everything,
Right.
because we're trying to save a man's life. And so the system in Louisiana doesn't really get it. The prosecutorial side doesn't really get
Right.
it. But those are enormous strains on resources.
Well, Derwyn Bunton, we're so glad to have you, and we wish you the best in getting the resources you need. I know you've been recruiting some great lawyers for your office, but I know the caseloads, the workloads, and everything depends upon having the resources. And you've been the public defender, chief defender there for 4 years. And we thank you for making the time to be with us today and wish you the best.
No, well, thank you for having me.
Sure.